This is me. I'm a pretty normal 15-year-old girl that lives in India. My family and I are Hindu. I have two best friends. One of them is Muslim. She believes that God spoke to Muhammad and told him to write down what he said in a holy book called the Quran. My other friend is Buddhist. She has a lot of rules in her household. She can't dance, receive money, or sleep in a bed. We're all 15 years old. You're probably wondering why I'm wearing something over my head. It's called a purdah or curtain, and as a Hindu I had to wear it after I got married. I married an 18-year-old Hindu man a couple of months ago. Child marriage is pretty common. When we got married, his parents demanded from my parents a dowry, which is when the husband's parents ask the wife's parents for either money or farmland. My family struggled to pay the large dowry that my husband's parents asked for, since we were farmers, like 70% of the population. Many farmers have to live with their livestock in sheds. Half of their income goes to the Mughal Empire, which was started by Emperor Akbar. My friend has a family who is actually one of these poor farmers. She married a man who asked for a large dowry. As a result of this large dowry, my friend felt so bad and pressured because her parents could not afford the dowry. She ended up killing herself, which is actually quite common among Muslim women. For a while, nobody noticed that my friend was dead because as a part of the Muslim culture, she had to live in a room completely separate from her husband's. Her family wasn't alone from a socio-economic standpoint. 110 million people lived in poverty during the Mughal Empire. From 1526 to 1857, the wealthy Mughal Empire ruled all of India. Textiles were a very large industry, and in 1 year they sold 400,000 textiles. Farmers had to give 50% of their revenue to the Mughal Empire. The leaders of the Mughal Empire were Muslim, and since they knew they were the minority, they allowed all ethnicities to coexist like Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus. The Mughals recruited Hindu warriors to strengthen their empire. The Mughals shared their powers with Hindus and their warriors, Jains, and Nawabs or regional leaders. They allowed these rulers to have Jagir, which was freedom of culture and religion. But once the British found a route to India and began to colonize, the Mughal Empire began to collapse. During the spice trade, opium was grown in India and smuggled illegally to China by the East India Company. Since the opium was sold to smugglers, it kept the East India Company clean. A war between China and the East India Company broke out, and control over trade with India ended for the East India Company in 1853. Here's some background information on the East India Company. By 1608, the company landed in India. In 1618, they made a trade agreement with the Mughal Empire, and by 1620, they had lots of trade posts. The company used gold and silver coins to trade with the Indians. In 1690, the rich company lost to the Mughals after trying to conquer more of India. In 1746, the British won their first battle against the Indians along with the French. At the Battle of Plassey, the company leader at the time, Robert Clive, was severely outnumbered by the French. A Nawab named Mir Jafar helped Clive to win against most of the Indians and the French. By 1769, 10 million Indians were starving and living in poverty after the British's victory. The company taxed a large amount of people led by a man named Siraj. They turned Nawabs against each other so that they could befriend them. Eventually, the company was taxing everyone in India, and it was all going to Britain. 10 million Indians were still unhappy. To make matters worse, Britain put a 78% tax on textiles. During something called Sepoy Mutiny, my husband would unfortunately die. Sepoys are Indian troops under British rule. Mutiny is a rebellion against the authorities. The rebellion started in 1857 when there was a rumor that British rifles were covered in pig or cow fat. 85 Sepoys refused to touch it. They wouldn't touch it because it would spiritually defile them. The rebellion lasted from 1857 to 1858, and it almost ended British rule altogether. But during the process, 80,000 Indian troops died. The Salt March was a revolt against the company led by Gandhi. In 1930, the company put a tax on all salt and required the Indians to buy only British salt. Many of them went without salt because they couldn't afford it. A man named Gandhi decided to take action. He led tens of thousands of people on a 240-mile journey to a town named Dandi by the Arabian Sea so that they could make salt on April 5th. I was actually a part of this rebellion, and I was able to make it to the Arabian Sea with Gandhi and his followers. On May 5th, Gandhi was imprisoned, but his satyagraha, which are followers, continued without him. The Indian police caught them and crushed the salt into mud. In 1850, the British's presence still grew and grew. By 1858, they officially ruled India. Queen Victoria announced that all Indians were equal in the eyes of the British, but this was not true. However, the British did do some good by creating railroads with trains and investing in school system and in the economy and the army in 1920. The Indian middle class experienced a lot of discrimination. Gandhi, who led the INC, would go to Britain to have a meeting about this case of discrimination and others. Winston Churchill said no to giving up any control of India, which just decreased the hopes of the Indians. After World War I, Britain lost a lot of power and decided that they didn't want India since it required a lot of upkeep and money. By 1947, the British released control of India, but there was no peace because nobody in India knew who would rule. The caste system, or socioeconomic levels, affected my life a lot. Brahmins were priests, scholars, and leaders. Kshatriyas were warriors, Vaishyas were farmers and merchants, and Shudras were peasants. The untouchables are last, and they are actually street cleaners. Sati also affected me a lot. After my husband died during Sepoy Mutiny, many people told me that as a widowed Hindu wife, I should have to choose between burning myself to ashes or being buried alive with my husband so that we could eventually be reunited in the afterlife. I didn't want to do either of those things, so I continued to live a happy life without my husband. Thank you for listening to my story.